All right. Hi, and happy lunch, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful Thursday. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this lunch and learn with us today. My name is Amanda LaFleur. I am the Executive Director for NOPI. We are a nonprofit incubator based just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, though we provide services across the United States and to nonprofits and informal charitable programs, no matter where they are located. A lot of you are already familiar with our organization because we have the pleasure of already getting to work with you. But if you've not had a chance to learn about us and what we do, I definitely invite you to check us out online at thenopi.org. Again, we're a nonprofit incubator and we approach nonprofit incubation through three different avenues. We do that through capacity building, back office wraparound support, under those two categories kind of together. And we also provide fiscal sponsorship where we extend our 501c3 designation to the programs that do not have one to accelerate their ability to access funding. And then we also provide professional development opportunities like the one we're having here today, just to increase your capacity and your work in strengthening the sustainability of your own organization or charitable program. So with that, I am so happy to have you here today, and I'm really happy to introduce you our presenter for today's Lunch and Learn. Michael Cosgrove has worked with and been a consultant to the public and nonprofit sector for over 15 years, helping design and implement programs and improve processes to meet their constituents' needs. Michael's a freelance consultant specializing in nonprofit and public sector program design for housing and neighborhood development, grant writing, and process analysis and improvement. Michael, thank you so much for doing this presentation with us today. Before I officially give it over to you, I did just want to announce that as you can see on the screen, there is closed captioning for today's Lunch and Learn. If you are using Zoom directly, there's also the option within Zoom to activate closed captioning if you would like to have it. For anyone that isn't able to attend in person or is viewing this or wants to view this again at a later time, we are recording today's session along with a transcript, and we'll send that out to everybody after today's session. So settle in with your lunch, and Michael, take us away.
Great, thanks for that introduction. And let me apologize in advance because somehow I scheduled this for garbage day, but I don't think you'll be able to necessarily hear the trucks in the background. I tried to find the quietest place in the house, but yeah, so it's good to be here today. Just sort of sharing with you like kind of my learnings on the consultant side, and often learnings through my own mistakes and successes, and sort of I approach this sort of as what I would really like folks to know on the other side, on the client side, in working with a grant writer, and I also I'll get into initially kind of retaining a grant writer and then how to best work with them from there. I've got about a 10-slide presentation, which should give us plenty of time for some question and answers. One thing I would like is, if the folks who are here could maybe, put in the chat, your name, your organization, if you have one, and what brought you here. And then I'll, as I get towards the Q&A, I'll make sure that I've kind of covered the things that you want to hear about. So from there, I will get on with my slideshow. And this is actually my first slideshow my first time controlling slides on Zoom. So yeah, exciting day for me. So first, kind of like to talk about, well, why hire an outside grant writer as opposed to maybe bringing the grant writing capacity in-house. So I mean, first off, if I can get the buttons to work right, there we go, is there's issues of internal capacity. Most nonprofits are fairly small, not been in existence for a hugely long time, and sorry, I have to move this window because it's distracting me. And you've got like just enough people to do the work that you're trying to do. And probably you don't even have enough to cover the work that really needs to be done in your community or with the population that you're trying to help. So that's one reason to bring in someone from the outside to help you with the grant writing. Second, if I can press the button, there we go. There's the issue of expense. So I think with an outside grant writer, there's the opportunity to really control the expense. Maybe you're not ready to bring in someone on board as a full-time or part-time employee. Maybe you just have a specific grant that you're trying to go after. So it's not, you can't take on the expense of a full-time employee if you're just going after a single grant. So whereas and I'll talk about this in a couple slides, but with a contract grant writer, you can build into the contract an hourly rate or a project rate. You can cap the hours and all that, so you can really control your costs. Next is just kind of related to capacity, is expertise. There are some grants in particular that require a great deal more expertise than others. I've in my practice done a lot of federal grants related to housing. So Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Veterans Administration, I recently wrote a grant for that. But then there's others, like I would never put myself out to write a grant related coming out from the Department of Energy. There's some other very technical, I probably wouldn't try to bill myself as being able to as having experience writing for Department of Agriculture grants. And again, those are very specialized, and unless you're a nonprofit of a certain size and you're regularly pursuing those, you probably don't have that expertise in-house to do the grant application. And last is I think that sometimes an outside person can really facilitate telling your story, because that's what grant writing is about. And not telling your story in like flowery language and all that, but just sort of telling what you do, who you help, and how you help them in a very compelling way. So those are just some thoughts on why you might want to consider hiring an outside grant writer. So getting your ducks in a row. By the way, my wife told me my slides were too kind of Civil War colors. It was kind of bad, but so I had to put in some yellow on this. But what do you need to do to have your kind of before you're going to start going out looking for a grant writer? First, what are you trying to fund? Are you basically trying to fund operating costs, which in the past have been more challenging to be funded, but funders have become more open to and realizing that operating costs are something that need funding. Is there a program that you want to start, or a program that you want to expand? So the first question before you go out to a grant writer is what are we trying to do? What do we want to do to seek funding for? I would say next, your grant writer is certainly going to help you build a budget, but kind of the building blocks of that budget are going to be, what's the staffing or the resources that we're going to need to carry this out? Are we going to need, a full-time or half an FTE? Are we going to need are we delivering resources out to the community? So along the lines of, meal programs or things like that. You don't have to build out the perfect budget, but just have kind of an idea of what, not only what you'd like to do, but what it would take to do it resource wise. Next is, I think in terms of communicating to the grant writer, and as you're seeking a grant writer, is a nice description of your organization. So that includes things like your mission, your vision, your objectives. If you don't, if you're at a place where you're kind of small enough that you don't have these things, then just maybe, put together some bullet points around, what you're about, what your work is about, what your organization is about, who you're trying to help, and why you see a need. And it doesn't have to be, eloquent and all that. It can be just kind of bullet points, because the grant writer's job is to, to write the grant proposals for you, but they need material from you to understand what it is you're trying to do. I mean, I've been on, I get a lot of my freelance work through Upwork, which is a freelance site. And sometimes I'll look and, it'll be like, we're looking for a grant writer for our nonprofit, and it won't say anything else. And I don't usually apply for those because I have no idea, what they're looking for, whether it's something I can help with, whether I'm qualified, whether it's an organization I feel comfortable working with. So just gather together, what you do have available. And if you don't have anything, just sort of jot down some notes on what your work is about. Similar, if you've got everything up on your website, that'll be one place that you can direct your potential grant writer to, but also, if you don't have that, just sort of, some bullet points on what kind of work you're doing. And, if you have multiple programs, especially, and then definitely around the one that you're seeking, the one or ones that you're seeking funding for. And I just threw this last bit in here on this particular slide, but I think it's important throughout, is that grant writing is a piece of a larger process. And that process includes sort of you working as the folks in your organization, leading organizations or supporting organizations, to build relationships with funders, because the grant writer can facilitate that, but ultimately the funders want a relationship with the organization. So next slide. So finding your grant writer. So, I've talked about this a little bit already, but what's the kind of level of expertise that you need? And that's based on, number one, do you know what grant you're going out for? Like, I've had very specific, the last grant I wrote was a client who said, we're operating a homeless shelter. We have a veterans wing within that homeless shelter. The VA has a grant to help build individual units for the veterans, because this is, COVID and trying to deconcentrate and, separate people. But they were comfortable working with me because I had background in housing and, both VA and HUD loans related to housing and homelessness. So, it would be sort of a different thing if you're looking for, folks who are writing grants to private foundations, which I've done as well. I think the other big piece is to kind of distinguish, if you know what grant you are going after and you're hiring someone to go after a specific grant, you don't need someone who has a lot of experience with kind of doing the cultivating and the finding of the grants, the grant seeking. So, just be aware, like, do I have a program I want to fund, and I just, I don't know where the funding source is, or, am I just hiring someone because I saw this grant, it seems like really aligned to what we do, and I need someone to kind of, walk me through that process and do the writing. Sort of where to look, I would say work your network, within your nonprofit community. There are professional associations. So there's a Grant Professionals Association, there's the American Grant Writers Association, there's the National Grant Writers Association. But these are places to potentially find grant writers. And then of course there's freelance sites like Upwork. There are a lot of freelance grant writers who are on Upwork, and there are other sites like that. I would also say, make sure you don't just, think of it like you're hiring staff, right? So you wouldn't just interview one person. You'd go through the resumes that are submitted to you, and you would select the best ones, and then you would then interview at least a few of them. So I would interview multiple grant writers so you have a basis for comparison. And then in terms of the things that you can like probe as part of that process, past clients and references. So just like with a job search, I have clients I've worked with that have provided references on my website, but also folks that I can tell potential clients to talk to. Obviously ask for writing samples so you can kind of evaluate them. And what you're looking for is, the ability to tell a compelling story without kind of flowery language, but just based on sort of, the ability of past clients to have seen a need, to have the capacity to meet that need, and how they're going to deliver, and how they're going to address that need. So, I mean, that's really kind of the structure of the story that you're looking for. You're not looking for a lot of adjectives and things like that. To me, grant writing is very much about organization. I've done grants where I've started working with a client where the grant's not due for like 5 or 6 months. I did one recently that was an economic development administration grant. It was just a highly complicated grant that involved not only my client, but my client's partnerships with others. And so, just that, just like you might interview a potential employee and as a program manager and want to know like how they organize themselves and how they organize their process, you're going to want to ask the same thing about to the grant writer. So ask things like, let's say I hire you, what would our first month look like working with you, or something along those lines. Of course, years of experience, evidence of prior success. So like what successful grants have you written, and domain expertise. So, I've talked about, I wouldn't seek out a job writing a Department of Energy grant, but, I'm very comfortable working in the housing and the reentry space. So it helps to have someone who understands the kind of the sandbox that you're playing in. What have they done to kind of keep up on the latest in terms of, training as a grant writer to keep their skills brushed up. And then, it doesn't hurt if they have a, true passion for your work. I have myself very strong feelings about reentry, about homelessness, and in an interview around either of those things, that passion comes through. I've written grants where I can tell my client's story and I can tell it in a compelling way, but I think it just helps to have that added energy around the passion for the work. Getting together the agreement. I'm not going to give any specific legal advice here, but make sure you describe the services. So I've had I've had agreements with clients that are just like, we're hiring you to work on this grant. This is the term. This is how long that we're going to have you work on it. Usually, if it's a specific grant, it's tied to the timeline around the deadlines for the grant. If it's, I've also had sort of, as needed services for, I worked with a large national organization that, had their own grant writing department, but on occasion would need, just a little excess capacity. So we had just sort of a yearly kind of hourly, very general agreement, where the services were to provide grant writing services as needed. You'll want to think about the fee. It's the hourly fee. There's the potential to get out of control. Of course, the fixed fee is nice because it's like, okay, I'm paying X amount of money for this one grant, but of course you can't do fixed if it's just sort of an open-ended grant writing services as needed plus grant seeking. Also, before I move off of the feed, I'll just sort of talk about two things. One is, what I've seen in general fees, like the range on hourly is pretty broad, like, 20 to 120 bucks an hour versus 150. I think if you hit like in the 30 to 75 range, that's probably not unusual and fairly, enough that you're probably getting a good grant writer. Obviously, you can't judge by their fee, but that you're not, sort of getting kind of the folks who, are more, I hate to say it, but like desperate for work. But yeah, that's sort of the general range I've seen. And then the other issue is this question that always comes up about, well, can I do it like a contingency fee? So if we get the grant, we'll pay you. If we don't get it, we won't pay you. And there are a couple of issues with that. One is in terms of the ethical standards for all the grant writing associations, that's seen as unethical, in part because you're almost building in the expense of the grant writer into the grant, which typically isn't an eligible expense. But if you're not paying them, if you otherwise don't have the money to pay them, and you're saying you're paying them if you get the grant, it seems like you're kind of, backdoor paying them through the grant. The other thing is, it's a lot of work. I mean, you want to compensate people for the work that they've done. And you can write a fantastic grant proposal, but if, I'm sorry, the captions confuse me every once in a while, but you can write a fantastic grant proposal, but everything depends on what's the funder actually looking for, how does the funder view the organization's capacity to deliver on what what they say they'll do. Who are you competing with? Because there's always a finite amount of resources out there. So it's not really, the grant writer can't control the outcome. And so there's sort of a fairness issue that if they've done the work, then they should be compensated for it. If you're doing a fixed fee, well, either way, make sure you include payment terms. Like if you're doing hourly, it's pretty typical to invoice every month and have a 30-day, payment on that. If it's fixed, you'll want to make sure, like, initial draft, you get 50%, things along those lines. Just think through negotiate the benchmarks with the grant writer. Make sure it's clear who is doing what. I mean, obviously the grant writer is responsible for coordinating the response to the grant or the grant proposal, or doing the actual writing. But you also need to acknowledge that, I as the client am going to provide them with the information they need, because, oftentimes you're the one, if it's about the work that you're doing, you're the one who has access to the initial information, certainly. That doesn't mean, I've done research for the grants. I've written for the Economic Development Administration grant. I had to find a lot of EDA materials to support the grant, but it was the client who knew how their workspace functioned, knew how their programs function, and they had to get that information to me. So make sure the agreement sort of spells out, who's doing what. It's always good just to specify that the grant writer is an independent contractor, so you don't run into any tax issues. And then typically, you want to make clear that you as the client own the end work product. And then also, especially, well, either way, whether it's hourly or fixed, you want to have a pretty clear termination clause that includes in it that the grant writer is going to turn over the work product to you. So onboarding, this is like the biggest thing for me. The grant writer is part of your team. The grant writer is not just sitting up here and doing their thing. Your team's doing their thing. I think it's good to have a kickoff meeting. This is, through my own mistakes, what I've learned. I worked with a fairly large client who had offices, and we were putting together a grant that had activities in California, Colorado, and New York, and at each of their offices, and there were different kinds of activities they did. And it wasn't until, this was the one we had about 5 or 6 months to do, it wasn't until about 2 months before that it became clear to me who was making a decision around what activities we were seeking funding for. And if I had to do it all over again, and from now on, I will always do it. I will coordinate a kickoff meeting with the client, anyone at the client who's part of that program delivery team, just so I understand what it is we're trying to do, and more importantly, understand who the decision makers are on the client side, just so we don't lose a whole lot of time. Talked about role clarity before. All that information you've gathered in the beginning, make sure you provide that. Make sure they know who to work with. And then on the side of resources, I would include sort of your, are you using a shared Google Drive? Are you using Slack? Do you have project management software? One thing I found was really helpful was I had access to the Google Drive with past grant applications for that EDA grant. And even though it was a completely new grant, it gave me such a better understanding of how the client worked. And so I was able to kind of use some of it to do some of my writing, and then kind of put together a list of, okay, these are the questions I still have for the client. So we were able to kind of efficiently have 30 to 45 minute meetings around, here's the gaps I need to fill in the proposal, because I wasn't able to find this anywhere. So I think it's good to have a cadence as you're developing a grant proposal with a grant writer. And what I mean by that is just, bi-weekly meetings or monthly meetings. It all depend on, are you, what's kind of the deadline that you're working against. And then frankly, on the Upwork, when I'm working with a new client, I say like, why don't we agree, you're paying me at this rate per hour. Why don't we agree after 5-10 hours, whatever, it depends on the project, but let's agree to have a check-in meeting, or let's agree that I won't put in more than that much time before the next check-in meeting. So I think that's really important, especially working with a grant writer that's new to you. Make sure that your team knows that it's important to communicate with the grant writer. The grant writer is kind of on the outside, and so they may have trouble getting a hold of a program manager or something like that. So you have to help facilitate that. Whatever data you have around your programs, make sure that the grant writer has access, and then make sure you're clear have a clear conversation with the grant writer around, we'd like the first draft by April 30th or whatever. And again, against the deadline that you're working on. Excuse me. And then just make sure, going back to that, sometimes it even goes back to that termination clause in the agreement that you have. If your grant writer is not performing, if they're not getting you the drafts when they said they did, you have to be able to keep that documented, and then exercise your termination rights if you have to. Hopefully it won't get to that, but it's just like, it's like working with an employee that if you have an issue with how the grant writer has presented something, or you're concerned about their communication, it's good to let them know that before things escalate, and don't avoid the conflict. Hopefully that won't happen. Submitting the proposal, typically in my experience, it's been the client that submits the proposal. Sometimes, especially with these federal grants and grants.gov, you kind of do it alongside each other. But the grant writer either way should provide you with, not only the grant, but like federal grants have like this SF 424 form and this, a bunch of forms. It's the government. But they should have that all packaged, and obviously these days it's not a paper package. Well, it could be, but most of the time it's electronic, so they should have it clearly labeled for you so that you're able to submit it. And then if it is something like a federal grant, that you might have to worry about things like the grants.gov interface and all that. Just build into your agreement that the grant writer is going to help with that, and make sure they've had experience with it. So, sort of other considerations. This is like purely selfish. Like, I write stuff and it gets submitted, and sometimes I never know what happened, and I just like to know what the outcome was. Just a nice thing. So, selfish thing there. Continue your relationship building with the funders. Some grant writers, can kind of coach you through that. I've actually worked with folks who don't do the grant writing piece, but specifically do the coaching around the relationship building. So, that's something to consider as well. But, just continue to, if you have a program officer you're working with, continue to do that relationship building work. Grant writer use of work product. I mentioned before, the client owns the work product. Typically you'll have some sort of, clarity around, who within your organization can approve. Like, I've used some of mine. I just, I use some of my grant proposals and just redact who the client is and any identifying information. But yeah, just it's helpful if they're able to access the work product, but you do want to have a process there. And then, if you like the work, consider providing a reference. So let me go back to the chat because I don't know if I covered anything or everything we were in addition. Yeah, all right. Well, we can oh, Amanda has some questions in there. Okay, so what is the best way or some helpful strategies to build a relationship with a potential funder? So I would say one thing is, well, first off, yes, the grant writer can definitely assist with building the relationships. If you're concerned about that, I think you want to make sure in the interview process that you sort of zero in on people who have experience in the community that you're seeking, in the funding community that you're seeking funding from. So, like here in Cleveland, I have relationships with like the Cleveland Foundation, Gun Foundation, and those are helpful for clients who are in Cleveland. But if you're NOPI in Massachusetts, I might not be the best person to help on the relationship building side. I can certainly help you think through like how you communicate with them, but if you want the actual networking value of the grant writer who might have relationships, then I probably wouldn't be the right person. I would say, all the foundations these days have kind of their own webinars, and now that we're back in person, they have in-person events. So just keep an eye out for those sort of things. Make sure you get on their mailing list. And then, and then beyond that, I would say just work your network to say, hey, I noticed that you've worked with Cleveland Foundation or something. Is there someone there that you think I should be talking to? So, all right, did I miss any other? All right, well, Amanda, how do you want to do questions beyond that?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all this helpful information. I feel like that relationships question comes up a lot through the organizations that we work with here at the incubator, because our members of the incubator, they span across the entire nonprofit life cycle. So we work with organizations that are just getting started out. They might be 1 to 2 individuals with an idea, all the way to organizations that are very well established. Some that even, came into the incubator with funding, but they needed the help with the managing of those funds and the administrative work that requires. And we see the ones that are most successful are the ones that have been able to create those relationships with grant makers. And I've always wondered, can a grant writer help bridge those relationships? So I appreciate the information that you shared and kind of ways to help you find the right grant writer. And maybe that is geographical in nature. Maybe it's, the focus area. But yeah, so that was just my part I wanted to throw in there. But yeah, anyone who has a question, feel free to unmute yourself. Within Zoom, there's a raise hand option, but I know that's not always easy to find. So feel free to unmute yourself, or you can pop it into the chat and we can answer from there.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Karen Bloomstein. I represent the Massachusetts Association for Gifted Education. And one of the things that I just popped to mind was whether or not there are any cycles when it comes to grants. Like in education, there are cycles around, times of the year. It's like testing season and it's not testing season. And I wonder if there are similar kinds of cycles in the grant writing world that we should be aware of so that we are more attuned to the life cycle of the industry.
So I would say yes, but I would say that the cycle probably more depends on the grantor. So, like and they're fairly easy to find for some of them. So like Federal Department of Education, or any federal department will usually have on their website, this is when we release, they call it either a NOFA or a NOFO, a notice of funding availability or funding opportunity. But yeah, so but they're fairly regular. I know with the homelessness work that I've done, that HUD releases those NOFA, I feel like it should be like NOFA or something, NOFAs that HUD releases them at a particular time of each year. And then most foundations, you could probably, if they're a foundation of a good size, you can probably find on their website. But one thing, if you're asking if you're looking for someone who's doing like kind of I can't think of a good, like the grant harvesting or whatever, like the grant seeking, that you should make sure that they're going to be capable to produce you a sort of a spreadsheet or something that identifies kind of that cycle of when the grants typically are released, and then when the application is due. That should be something that any grant seeker should be able to give you. And then some foundations have just kind of rolling applications. So
Okay, so I'm hearing that it's not something where, it's like, okay, everyone releases their grants, on a quarterly basis, and here we go. It's time for the first quarter grants to roll out. It's it can be kind of willy-nilly, and depending on which organization or which industry you are in and their own cycle on whether or not they have something there.
yes.
Okay, all right, that's helpful. Thank you.
Let's see, I'm reading Tracy's. I was told that the grant writer is paid upfront. However, the fee can be included in the administrative cost statement. Do you agree? I guess I would, so it sounds like the question is about kind of recovering the cost of hiring a grant writer. And I assume by upfront you mean like at the as part of the grant process, and then seeking it through the administrative cost statement. I'm going to say I'm going to give like the most unsatisfying sort of, it depends. Like it's got to be pretty clear in the application, in the instructions from the funder, that's an eligible administrative cost. The other piece is like sometimes a cost is, you sort of put it as part of your project. So like your grant writing costs as part of your project, but then you have like certain things that are, like federal government, we have a lot of like match type stuff. And so maybe it's eligible as a match, but it's really going to come down to the instructions and the definition of acceptable administrative costs. And again, just because it's acceptable administrative costs as part of a project, it might, I feel like I'm getting a little off kind of the basics, but like you can have, we have a $50,000 project, and of that, like we have this $5,000 administrative costs, and like $2,000 is the grant writing services. Those might, just because it's an eligible part of the project, it might not be a reimbursable cost out of the grant. It might be like part of a match or something like that. Sorry to ramble on that one a little bit.
So, I wanted to find out something, particularly about a new organization. We are still working with with NOP to see whether we can, with NOPI to see whether we can join their incubation. But as an organization starting, I wanted you to share some of the interesting experiences that we need to know about starting a new organization, building the image and the reputation outside there to be able to write a successful grant for that organization, because sometimes it becomes very difficult to step into the ring when you are a new organization just coming up. Do you care to share some perspective?
Yeah, so I want to make sure I caught all that, or well, I think you're right. It's actually it's difficult as a new organization. I think it's one thing that's great is to have sort of these intermediary organizations that can kind of help serve as like a fiscal agent and kind of guide you along the way, and also seek funding for your activity. The other thing is, are there potentials for other partnerships with kind of more established organizations? And then last piece, and I apologize, I can't remember if you said what sort of what your activities were and all that, but sort of regardless, like there are a lot of like we have like in Cleveland, like they call them like these neighborhood connections grants that are kind of like small scale activity grants in very like hyper local community grants. So sometimes there are, and then actually there's also a foundation, St. Luke's Foundation here in Cleveland, that they are more looking to kind of fund more grassroots work that isn't necessarily like a full nonprofit 501c3. They just see it as part of their mission to support that grassroots work, and they know that it's not necessarily going to be like fully established organization and all that. So yeah, I mean, I do agree it's hard as a newer organization, and I would say kind of look for those kind of micro grant activity grants, like those hyper local grants. Look for potential partners, and look for fiscal agent organizations and folks that do the work like NOPI does. I hope that was helpful. What do you mean by match? So some grants, and I think you'll see this less on the private foundation side and more on the government side. They'll basically say that you have to bring money to the table, and that you have to bring, if you're seeking $10,000 grant. I'm just throwing out numbers, but you're seeking a $10,000 grant. 5% of that, 10% of that has to be matched by the organization. I should be careful. It's not like you're just pure operational funding. It could be matched by like another grant. Like you could say, Cleveland Foundation is going to give us $10,000 for this project out of the full $50,000 project. So the match is just meant to be a certain percentage of the whole project that does not come from the government grant. Any other questions? Yeah, stacking would be another word for it. By the way, I'm having a conversation with Tracy in the chat, so just.
This is Amanda. I actually have a question.
Sure.
Are for individual or for organizations that don't necessarily have the as you talked about earlier on, the funding readily available to hire a grant writer. Are there some reliable resources that you can recommend to maybe couple with the process? Like, do you have any platforms that you recommend to search for grants or to fine tune your grant search?
Yeah, so I use Candid, and these days, so this, something you could take advantage of, anyone on this call. I haven't had to do grant seeking for a little while, so I don't pay for Candid, but I do find there's usually like one public library location in whatever city you're in or county that has free access, but you have to be like on site. But it's a very comprehensive database resource. And then I subscribe to things like philanthropy.com. I subscribe to the Candid newsletters, which are and I think it's candid.org. It used to be the Foundation Center. But I subscribe to their newsletters, so sometimes I'll see a funding opportunity. So it's like less useful if the newsletters don't really help you if you're like, okay, I want to do this, and I want to find a grant to support it. It's more like just kind of keep you in the loop, so that maybe, oh my goodness, there's this thing that just came out with a grant. If you're doing the heavy research, I would say you can hopefully figure out where in your local library or which local library branch has access to Candid.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So yeah, so Candid, I think it's FDO now, free directory online. We haven't used that for quite some time here at NOPI. But yes, I have gone the route where you go to the public library where they have that available. A couple of resources I would like to share from us here at NOPI are Impala Digital. I don't know if anyone here on the call has had a chance to check that out. That is, I feel like, kind of the next level up. It's a place to gather information about different grant makers as well as other nonprofits, and a way to cross-reference the data. So if you know other organizations that are doing work similar to yours, you can look them up on Impala, and then you can see who their funders have been. And you can also do that in reverse. You can look up a funder and see what kind of organizations they have funded. And you can cross-reference that data to kind of figure out, would this grant maker be potentially interested in our work, in supporting our work? You of course want to check other requirements, like, are you in their geographical location that they tend to fund? Really, are they looking for organizations that they already have a relationship with? How open are they to new applicants or new grantees? So that's one I really like to recommend. And I'm going to put these in the chat as well in our follow-up email for today's session. Another platform we love to use here is Instrumental. Have you used that one before, Michael?
I know it, but I haven't used it.
Yeah, we use that one here at the incubator. We kind of cross-share it with all of our programs. But that's a really great one. Also shares background information about grant makers and foundations. But that one, what's different between that and Impala is that one will actually be auto-looking based on keywords, potential grants for your organization. So that can also help you fine-tune as well as track your grant application process across your team. So I do have a link for that for 1 month free. I'll also send that out if your organization would like to give it a try. Impala is really free to access for anyone, but some of their features, they're rolling out state by state. You have to check them out, but I'll share those resources as well. In the past, we've also used GrantStation, which has a free weekly newsletter like you talked about, but that's really broad. So if you're looking for grants in your particular area, it may or may not be helpful to you as a free newsletter. But if you have in your state or location like a nonprofit association, I know here in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network sends out like pretty regularly a list of grant opportunities for the area in Massachusetts. So just a couple of ideas to add on to what you just shared of places to look for grants. But again, I feel like working with a grant writer is sometimes the only path forward, especially if you don't have a background in writing grants yourself. Just the time investment into taking classes or learning the skills. And actually, I know we're coming to near the end, but I know this is a 1 minute to ask this question. But what are your thoughts about using AI to help with grant writing like ChatGPT?
So I haven't tried it yet. I haven't tried it for grant writing yet. I have sort of, I'm sure everyone's played around with ChatGPT a little bit. I think it's potentially a nice way to kind of help clarify your thoughts and get some organization. But sometimes it gets things wrong or makes up things. So, you obviously are going to have to do a fair amount of editing. And then I've never really, maybe I'm a little bit of a Luddite, but I sort of question like, what's its ability to, like, how persuasively can it really write versus a human? And I've seen some, not on the grant writing side, but on the marketing side, where people have kind of compared output that they've gotten out of ChatGPT or similar tools, and not really thought it was as persuasive or really captured the emotion very well. But on the other hand, it doesn't take that long to use, so you can try it out. And it can just be, so even if it can't produce like a whole grant proposal for you, maybe you'll like some of the ways in which it's posed things.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for addressing that. We're actually going to be doing next month a whole webinar on the potentials of using AI to assist with grant writing and other uses within nonprofit organizations. So we'll send out information about that as well to everyone that's attended here today. Michael, thank you so much for taking your time, donating your skills, your talent, your expertise, and sharing that today with everyone. And just thank you everyone for spending your lunch with us today. I hope this was informative and helpful to you. And we hope to see you at a future event or have the opportunity to work with you in the future. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.